On Edward's way home, there was suddenly a tree. An old man was sitting under it. The old man called out to Edward. The old man's hand passed over Edward's shoulder. A frog appeared in the old man's hand. Edward was wondering why there was a frog on me. The frog in the old man's hand turned into a rose. Edward didn't know what was happening. The rose in the old man's hand turned into a flute. Edward was shocked. The flute was floating in the air. While Edward was looking at the flute, the old man disappeared. And so did the tree. From then on, Edward fell in love with magic. Edward practiced in his bedroom. Edward practiced when he walked. Sophie, who was riding by on her horse, was fascinated by Edward. Sophie followed Edward to Edward's house. Edward asked Sophie to choose a playing card. Sophie drew a card at random. She put the card back. Edward was a little nervous. Edward picked out the card that Sophie had chosen. The cards were floating in the air. Edward took off his black gloves. He threw them into the air. The gloves turned into two crows and fly away. The audience looks back at the two crows. Edward takes out a small box. He invites the audience to offer their handkerchiefs. A woman in the audience brings out a white handkerchief. Edward puts the white handkerchief into the box. The woman wanted to see if the handkerchief was still there. Edward told her to wait and see. Edward took out another orange. The orange is cut in half. Edward takes out the core of the orange. The core is put into an empty flower pot. Edward closed his eyes. In the next moment, the core sprouted in the pot, and the seeds kept growing. The audience stared in disbelief. The seeds in the pot had grown. There were several oranges hanging from the tree. Edward picks two oranges. Two oranges were thrown to the audience. The woman in the audience opened the little box. The handkerchief was gone. The white handkerchief appears on the stage. The white handkerchief has the butterflies on it. The audience gave Edward a standing ovation. A sword stood in the center of the stage. The general went on stage and tried to pull out the sword. The general gave it his best shot. The sword moved only a little on the floor. Just now, Edward was performing a magic trick in the palace. In the center of the stage was a drawing board. Edward didn't have a brush in his hand. Drawings began to appear on the board. Edward ran his fingers through the air. The next moment, a picture of the king appeared on the board. The ministers applauded. The crown prince thought Edward was hiding something. He was trying to make a fool out of Edward. The crown prince searched Edward's entire body. He found nothing. Now it was time for Edward to humiliate the dauphin. The dauphin handed Edward his sword. Edward stood the dauphin's sword in the center of the stage. Only the owner of the sword can pull it out. The audience was amazed. Edward invited a prince to come up and try. The prince couldn't pull out the sword even with all his strength. Edward gave the dauphin a look. The crown prince took hold of his sword. The crown prince pulls out his sword with ease. The crown prince was about to fall into Edward's trap.